Good morning. No, it's good afternoon now because it's 12:01 here in Washington, D.C. Good afternoon to people joining us in the United States, in Germany, and elsewhere around the globe. My name is Jeff Rathke. I'm the president of the American Institute for Contemporary German Studies here at Johns Hopkins University. And I'm really delighted that we are able to host this discussion today with two excellent commenters. And I'm going to turn the reins over to my colleague, Senior Fellow Eric Langenbacher, who is the director of our program for Society, Culture, and Politics here at AICGS. Today's discussion will focus on the German EU presidency, which took place in the second half of 2020. Still a relevant topic, especially when we look at the ongoing difficulties with the pandemic in Europe, renewed questions about things like the vaccination campaign, in addition to the questions of economic recovery. And I think we'll also get into a discussion today as well about the legacy of Chancellor Angela Merkel, having completed now her last EU presidency, and with about 6 months left before the German federal election this year. So there is a lot to talk about, and I will not stand in the way further. So let me pass the microphone over to Eric Langenbacher, who will guide us through today's event. Eric, over to you.
Thanks, Jeff, and welcome to everybody, and especially to our two speakers today. It's really my great pleasure to briefly introduce first Professor Dr. Gabriele Abels, who's the Jean Monnet Chair of Comparative Politics and European Integration at the Institute of Political Science at the University of Tübingen in Germany. She is remarkably broadly published with her research interests centering on German EU politics, European integration theories, gender perspectives, the role of parliaments, and the regions in the EU. I might highlight two important books that she has been an author or co-editor of in recent years. First, the Routledge Handbook of Gender in EU Politics, which came out or is coming out this year with two co-editors. And then Regional Governance in the EU, Regions and the Future of Europe, which came out in 2019. And then Gendering European Integration Theory, Engaging in New Dialogues, also co-edited, which came out in 2016. Then we're going to have our great friend and ally, Professor Joyce Mushaben, who's the Curator's Professor of Comparative Politics and former Director of the Institute for Women and Gender Studies at the University of Missouri. Her teaching has centered on comparative public policy, the European Union, women's leadership, citizenship, immigration, megacities, and sustainability issues. And her research covers new social movements, youth protests, German unification and identities, gender, ethnicity, and welfare issues, as well as EU migration and integration studies. So first, we're going to have Professor Abels give a brief presentation, and then Professor Mushaben will be our commentator for today. Then we will open up to a question and answer portion. For those of you who are aware of how we've been doing things online here at AICGS, you'll see that there is a Q&A button at the very bottom of your screen. Please type your question in there at the appropriate time, and then I will read out the questions to our panelists, which allows me to kind of combine questions to go with the flow and things like that. So without further ado, Professor Abels, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, everybody, and thanks, Eric, and thanks, Jeff, for having me. It's a bit of a substitute for not being able in DC like I was supposed to be last fall for 2 months, which would have, of course, been fabulous. So what I would like to do today is, let me start this here, that I would like to give an overview of the Council Presidency in crisis, because I think it was really in crisis in different perspectives, and evaluating the accomplishments been made by the German Council Presidency, and discuss some of the shortcomings. And I do assume that not everybody of you is as familiar with the EU system. So just a little bit of background before then I look more in detail into the German Council presidency. But of course, when we look at the EU political system, three key institutions are key. The Council here being one of them, which consists of the Council of Ministers, as it was previously called, and the European Council. The European Council is a meeting of heads of states. That's where Merkel is, of course, meeting with her fellow leaders, but she is not chairing that meeting because that's what the Council presidency does. The permanent Council presidency. We have so many presidencies that it's sometimes a bit confusing. So we really speak of the Council of the EU Presidency as part of the EU bodies, which are part of the legislative triangle here. So just very briefly, Council Presidency, what does it mean? So it means chairing the meetings of the Council of the EU. And these meetings come in various formations because there are 10 different formations of meetings of national ministers here. And in addition to that, it means chairing a number of other meetings of the permanent representatives, the so-called Coreper. So that was pretty stressful time for the German ambassador in Brussels, and for the council working groups and committees. And so that is about 200 different committees and working groups, which are part, that chairing is part of the council presidency here. And so it's chairing all these except for, as I said, the European Council, because that Michel's duty to do that as permanent European Council presidency, and the Foreign Affairs Council, because that is chaired by Borrell as the representative for foreign affairs. But the rest of the council presidencies, and as I said, all the working groups, committees are chaired then by the Germans in this case. It's a rotating presidency. It's for 6 months, and that is important to bear in mind because, I mean, look 1 year, look 6 months back, what were you thinking of you would get done within 6 months when you think of your plans last fall? And so pretty similar to that, 6 months is a very short time, particularly in times of crisis and in times when people have very high expectations of what the Germans could and should do. Of course, they are not doing that by themselves. The Council General Secretariat plays a major role here, and of course, all the German ministries. It's hundreds and hundreds of civil servants who are involved in that. I said 6 months. Since 2009, there is a principle of the trio presidency. So Germany is at the moment still involved in the trio presidency together with the Portuguese and the follow presidency. So it's always predecessors, current and successor presidency country who join that, and that is important for ensuring some coherence, and they do have their trio presidency programs. The expectation towards council presidencies is certainly to move the EU forward. There are always loads of conflicts on the tables, loads of leftovers from previous presidencies. So the idea is that they should find solutions, come up with compromises, mediate conflicts, but also bring in their own priorities. Having said this, what does it now mean for the council presidency last year? Discussion over the program, of course, started much earlier in 2019, but it really took a long time for the German Council presidency to come up with a program. They had the trio program together with Croatia and Portugal, some point published in 2019. Interestingly, that for the first time, as I see it, had a bit of a part on gender equality, because the Germans are not very strong in terms of making gender equality as part of social policy a priority of their council presidencies. The Scandinavians are much better when it comes to that. So, and the German government was certainly hoping that a number of issues would be solved before they make it and take on their council presidency, especially the multi-annual financial framework program. And they wanted it to be solved in 2019 or by the Croatian government presidency at the latest, but that didn't work out, because then it was the onset of the crisis, of the pandemic, and the Croatians were pretty much overwhelmed with that. So in spring 2020, there was a readjustment of the program. It was necessary due to the crisis, a number of issues which were still open, such as the MFF. So what the Germans then did is they came up with a rewritten program together for Europe's recovery. So it was obviously very much focused on the pandemic. And the idea was then to have this be a motor of integration, be a moderator for all the conflicts on the table, and building bridges, finding solutions that would work for all. But with 27 member states, 27 governments, very polarized discussions in the council, that is a real major challenge here. What they did is then that they focused on some areas. So these are the four areas that were pretty prominent here. Pandemic, of course, features here as the top priority, and the economic recovery. But of course, a lot of the health-related issues were important as well. Then in addition to that, as I said, there was still the multi-annual financial framework programs for the years 2021 to 2027 for 7 years. Future relations with the UK, that was on the agenda too, although it wasn't that prominent for the German presidency, because there was, of course, Commission involvement. There was Michel Barnier. But a lot of the discussions in relation to future relations regarding trade and a number of other issues, security cooperation, they were still on the table. And then a large focus area which has a number of issues, climate policy, of course, digitalization, Europe's role in the world, and part of that was also issues in relation to social policy. So the guiding principles always sound great: make Europe stronger, more innovative, a fair, sustainable Europe, security, common values, a Europe which is strong in the world. Sounds great. But of course, the question is, what are the outcomes? How successful were they? There were two key challenges for the presidency. The first, of course, is related to the pandemic and to the logistics. We all know from looking at international diplomacy, at negotiations, and in the EU context, it's very important to have these face-to-face meetings, so that the leaders can then discuss some of the things bilaterally, that they can mediate conflicts for finding compromises. That is very, very important here, and also not only in the European Council, but also in the Council of the EU. But the European Council was, of course, very important here as well. And the challenge was how really to zoom the Brussels compromise machine to the digital world. Several meetings were organized in Brussels, but the majority of meetings was online. And as I said, in a normal council presidency, you have easily 1,500 meetings within half year. And all this had to be transferred, or the majority of that online, because even in Brussels, in the nice fancy council building, the majority of rooms were not big enough to host said 27 national delegations, and then still keeping up with distance rules and all that. So a lot of them was digital. And the second key challenge was, of course, expectation management. Due to the crisis, there were very high expectations that the Germans should get a lot of things going, so that a lot of things which were still on the table would be solved. And the idea, of course, was that Germany could more easily do it than any of the smaller countries like Croatia, who had the previous council presidency, or Portugal, who has the current presidency. So many really thought that it's lucky chance, that it's the Germans again in the driver's seat, because the last time the German had the presidency was in 2007, and that was after, or still in the midst, one could say, of the so-called constitutional crisis, after the constitutional treaty failed to be accepted in national referenda in 2004 and 5. And then it was the Germans, and particularly Merkel, who helped saving the constitutional treaty, and so that the outcome in 2007 under German, prepared by the German presidency, was then the so-called Lisbon Treaty, which is in force since 2009. So a lot of that thought, well, maybe this experience helps, so that the Germans, that it's their turn again, can help again in crises, in solving this crisis. So the expectation was then, of course, that they would deal with the pandemic. That was obvious, that the health issues and economic issues are key here, and a number of other issues, because there was still EU and US relations, transatlantic relations, okay, sorry, I think we just had a little technical problem here. Right. So I was here. So there was a lot of talk. Is this going to be just a Corona presidency, or is there still room for other issues? And there was some, but certainly very, very limited. And looking at the issue of national preferences and what the Germans do, of course, we have to bear in mind what are Germany's preferences towards EU policy. What priorities would they set here? And just very, very briefly, but of course, holding the EU together was always a key issue. And holding the 27 member states together. And this is increasingly an important topic with a more polarized EU, and particularly with a lot of opposition from Central and Eastern European countries. privileged partnership with France is important. Before the Council Presidency, there was a lot of pressure on this tandem. There was really a lot of tensions in the Franco-German relationship, and that's why it was so important that it was a German-Franco initiative to come up with an idea for the recovery fund. The idea of sharing sovereignty is key here, multilateralism, usually a very supranational orientation, but in response to the various crises already since 2007, 2008, we certainly have much more intergovernmental negotiation here, or what Merkel once called the union method. And in times of crisis, that is so important, and that's why the European Council was so important, even if Merkel herself was not chairing these meetings. Principle of subsidiarity for the Germans is very important, and this pertains also to financial issues. And that's why in the Euro crisis in 2008, the Germans were never in favor of having Euro bonds, shared debts and all that. So the question was, what would it mean now in relation to the pandemic? The perception of German policy was clearly, as you can see here, that Europe is growing, but that Germany is particularly growing, and at the expense of other member states, that Germany is a reluctant hegemon here, particularly with now having a German commission, a German commission president, that this would even have a much bigger effect. And the major question was, what does Merkel want? Where does she want Europe to go? Does she want to leave a mark here? And is she able, like she was in 2007 here, to take the initiative and help put the EU forward? And I would say that there was some remarkable change here, that before the Council Presidency already started in June last year, that Merkel gave a remarkable speech in the Bundestag, Europe needs us and we need Europe, and with some interesting statements. I'm not going to read them out, but certainly making it clear that we live in extraordinary times and it requires extraordinary measures. And of course, she was defending that at that point, Macron and Merkel had already developed the idea of the so-called recovery fund. And that is one of the key issues here, which was discussed in relation to the crisis. And I think it's also one of the major accomplishments. So having said that, take a look at some of the achievements. It is very important that finally, after 2 years of discussion, the MFF, the Multi-Annual Financial Framework Fund, was decided with almost 1.1 trillion euros for 7 years. And in addition to that, the Recovery Fund, which is called Next Generation EU. So that's interesting wording, with 750 billion euros. But as part of the very tough negotiations here, 50% is loans and 50% is support given to those countries most affected. So that is, of course, very, very important in terms of solving or dealing with the pandemic. Coordination of anti-COVID-19 measures was a key issue here in terms, what does it mean for the Schengen area, for just buying vaccines, for a number of issues which were involved here. Then another key area was what's going to happen in common foreign and defense policy. There was some success with regards to developing a system for what's called a strategic compass that is now launched. A key issue in relation then also to EU-NATO relations is that as part of the so-called PESCO, this allows now for third country participation in the PESCO initiative in the field of security and defense policy. And climate change, there is a conclusion for a climate law with setting the 50% CO2 emissions reductions by 2050, becoming a climate neutral, CO2 neutral continent. And again, coming up with a financial support instrument, the so-called Just Transition Fund. But here a lot of questions are still open, as I will mention in a second. EU-China agreement on investment, that was a key issue on the German agenda because German-Chinese trade relations are so important, an investment from the German side into China. And so that was a high priority just before the end of the German presidency, that there was a decision on this comprehensive agreement on investment. It's still now discussed with the European Parliament, so that is not set, but having the Council decision on that investment and having concluded the negotiation with China was of course a major issue, and that is not without its critics. Actually, there was some development in regarding trade and cooperation with the UK. There is now the comprehensive agreement discussed at the moment. Again, there was some development in the field of human rights, a stronger human rights mechanisms, mechanism for exchanging views among the member states, a stronger role for the European Convention for Human Rights. Here, there is the opening of the European Center for Civilian Crisis Management in Berlin. So that was a very symbolic issue for the Germans with their more soft power approach to foreign policy, that this civilian crisis is now located in Berlin. And in relation to the social pillar, some developments linked to gender equality initiatives, to equal pay, violence against women. There is a little bit of success here. And finally, what was a contested issue, the Council Declaration on SOFOE, the Conference on the Future of Europe. That is something that is going to start now in May this year, finally. So some achievements, but let me take a look at leftover shortcomings. The recovery fund was only possible to come for a compromise because the rule of the law conditionality was weakened. And that is what was very much contested and is still very much contested. It's good, I think, that there is this conditionality finally included. That was a highly discussed topic, but it was weakened, so it was watered down. Then it's very clear that in relation to public health, much more is needed and to be expected from the Union, that it has to become much stronger in dealing with the pandemic. The Green Deal, Just Transition Funds, a lot of them was watered down because it's not clear how strict the regulations and guidelines are, how much leeway for the member states to take the money and do with it whatever they want, even if they invest still in coal and in some developments and some technologies which are not climate friendly. The trade deal with China, that is of course a major issue in relation to transatlantic relationship. Was it very clever to do that rather than wait for the Biden administration to come in and then develop a joint strategy as to how to deal with China? High priority on the German agenda was also the new pact on migration and asylum. That's an issue, of course, discussed for years. That is still open because it's so contested, it's still so polarized, and I don't think that we will see progress here in the near future. Stabilizing the fragile neighborhood, particularly regarding Belarus. Not much has happened here. And so that's still a crucial issue. And finally, just one of the issues in the area of social policy, gender equality policy, still a lot of unsolved issues. Some of that is pretty irritating for me because, like, even the so-called Women on Boards Directive, which is blocked by the Germans, was not unblocked, despite the fact that we have a national law these days. The German government, the CDU part, was not willing to unblock that. The Istanbul Convention on Violence Against Women and Domestic Violence, there was hope that the Germans would be able to unblock that because from some of the Central European countries there was they use a veto. They don't want to adopt it as a EU regulation for a number of reasons. We can discuss that in detail, but that of course is pretty crucial given that and due to the pandemic, we see a rise of violence against women here. So still a lot of issues which are on the table here. So just if I draw a very brief conclusion here, I would say it's a mixed bag. The good news is that this brought along a new push for Franco-German relations. The Franco-German motor is working better than it did a couple of months ago. And this initiative by Macron and Merkel for the recovery fund, that was very important. This funding scheme, for the very first time, allowing the EU to be a lender on the international financial market and to give out loans, that is, of course, really a dramatic and paradigmatic change in EU policy and in Germany's position, because there was always the fear that this would bring along major debts for Germany, and the Germans were never in favor of that because they always felt, well, it's German taxpayers' money that is not used very well at EU level. Very positive in general was also that the German agenda was streamlined with the Commission's agenda, and in that respect, of course, it was very helpful to have a German Commission president, and as you know, von der Leyen is very close to Merkel and was her longest standing national minister. Final aspect which I would like to mention, leadership. Merkel it was her second council presidency, as I said, and in the 2007 presidency, it was crucial that she took leadership here, although it was a very different kind of crisis here. It was an endogenous crisis, and it was quite well managed, so that the constitutional crisis then led to the Lisbon Treaty. Now the pandemic and exogenous crisis, but which developed into an endogenous crisis of the EU institutions, of the EU not being able to really develop a good coordinated crisis response here, certainly a crisis that needs strong leadership here also for the EU. The Germans brought, and particularly Merkel, brought along some leadership. So as I said, for the funding scheme, that is very, very crucial that she changed her position here. And but also in relation to some of the other some of the other ministries did, because it's all German ministries being involved. We cannot just look at Merkel alone, even though the Chancellery, the Bundeskanzleramt, and the Auswärtiges Amt, the Department Foreign Affairs, has a crucial role here. So to me, it is a mixed bag. I would have hoped for more, but of course, it was very limited in terms of what you can do within 6 months and under these conditions. But at some related to some areas, I do see a lack of political will to move forward here. And I stop here. So thank you.
I guess I go. All right. If you look closely at Gabi's opening slide, you will see that she used the German symbol for the Council Presidency 3 times on the first slide. That symbol was introduced by Heiko Maas on May 29th of 2020, and it is supposed to represent the larger agenda that Germany has. Discovered by mathematicians Johann Benedict Listing and August Ferdinand Möbius in 1858, the Möbius ribbon, or strip as it's sometimes called, was a very fitting symbol for EU multi-level governance. It consists of a one-sided surface with only one boundary curve embedded in a 3-dimensional space. A line drawn along the edge travels in a full circle to the point opposite the starting point. But if you continue along that line, it leads back to the starting point, transversing the entire boundary. According to Maas, the Möbius strip represents an integrative, innovative Europe, bringing together very diverse sets of peoples and interests into a common whole in an act of singular solidarity. And one could also say, looking at this structure, what goes around comes around. The truth is that the EU Council Presidency ain't what it used to be. And it does sometimes appear to be traveling in circles with regard to its many unresolved conflicts. The establishment of the single European market accelerated the pace of integration, as did the reforms embedded in the Maastricht Treaty, starting with the citizenship rights. Well, this was followed by the Big Bang of Central East European expansion, 2004-2005. And all 3 of these things have, I think, contributed to a revolution of rising expectations. I'm very sorely tempted here as a non-technology person to add the invention of apps, which I think has deluded people into thinking that politics, like life, all you have to do is click something on your phone and major policy changes will be delivered to your door like a fresh pizza. This is not the council I grew up with, the one Gabi has described here. I've been following the EU since the 1980s, when most people, especially feminists, thought of it, if they thought about it at all, as a rich male industrialist club. Although I was a West Europeanist, not one of my European comparative politics professors at IU offered a course on the European community in the late 70s and the early 1980s. Unless you studied trade relations, the community was perceived as a well-paid place for seasoned statesmen to go in order to fade away after retiring from national politics. It didn't really become interesting for me until the 1990s, when suddenly there was a surge in gender equality policies, a lot of really juicy Court of Justice verdicts, and a few power bones thrown to the European Parliament. I therefore feel it's my duty as a pensionista who's now connected to the German and European Studies Center at Georgetown to bring a bit of historical context to this discussion. 2020 marked the 13th time that Germany has held the rotating presidency, but I would argue even its earlier experiences coincided with some pretty heavy regional crises. For the second time, Germany assumed the presidency from July to December 1961, right in the middle of the Berlin Wall construction. Now, back then, nobody expected Germany to assert a leadership role, and there was certainly no such thing as a common European and security and defense policy at odds with US domination of NATO. For the last 2 decades, Germany has been juggling multiple international or multilateral roles. In 2007, it simultaneously chaired the G8 summit. You might recall the big meetings and the violence that ensued at Heiligendamm. That was the first time that Merkel introduced the concept of climate change and even was able to persuade George W. at the end that climate change was real and maybe the US ought to think about doing something about it over the next 50 years. As if responding to a global pandemic weren't enough in those 6 months of 2020, the German Council Presidency overlapped with its rotating role as chair of the UN Security Council in the face of ongoing humanitarian crises in Syria, Sudan, and Yemen. The presidency itself has taken on new significance since the Swedes occupied the chair for the first time in 2001. This really hit me about 7 years down the road from that. Swedes declared that they were going to pursue a proactive agenda for advancing gender equality. Now, up to that point, the presidential workload had been pretty minimal. The core functions consisted of planning and chairing meetings, representing the EU abroad, and helping member states to defend their national interest. The other big task, of course, was to schedule and host opulent summer summit dinners in one's own capital at the beginning and the end of each term. The council as a whole served as an emergency brake against integration to prevent the Commission from going too far, too fast in too many areas. Now that 6-month period serves as a chance for the presiding country to prove itself as a driving force of integration. You need a symbol, you need a slogan, you need a formal agenda that you start planning almost a year in advance, and you top it all off with formal conclusions on what you've covered. Every country wants to go home to report that they've accomplished something big for integration. For newer member states, presiding over the council has offered a chance to bolster national egos. It has made them feel like full members of a club, not just poor relations. I remember the Czech presidency, the time and effort they put into coming up with symbols, and they had quizzes online, and they used it as an opportunity also to educate their own populations about how the EU really works. Now, I think Angela Merkel had already raised the bar for the Council presidency during her term in 2007. She is now well known for pushing herself and others through all-night Council internal negotiating sessions. She even masterminded, as we know, the Lisbon Treaty following the failed ratification of the Constitution. But instead of wrestling with 6 or 9 or 12 or maybe even 15 Western states who tended to get along pretty well and shared values before 2004-2005, Council presidents now have to appease 26 national leaders, 1/2 of whom have very different value orientations rooted in 40 years of Cold War division and processing their own past. Once it secures a measure of consensus in the council, the presiding state has to now broker a very different set of interinstitutional compromises due to more complicated legislative procedures. Now, this brings me to the question of institutional realpolitik, a very nice German word that is used to shape a lot of international relations discourse. I think it's very fitting that Gabi started out reminding us of the changing nature of EU decision-making. Amended several times since 1958, the qualified majority voting system gave rise to the idea of a potential blocking minority. But the blocks that have evolved over the last several years, particularly since 2004, 2005, rarely fall along the same axis. We saw the North-South division regarding the Euro crisis, France siding with the Mediterranean countries most deeply affected, and Germany heading the core of northern Scandinavian states who wanted to impose very different kinds of policies, not an all-out bailout. We see a lot of East-West divisions over the question of renewable energy and climate change, and also the refugee crisis. We see small versus big countries lining up regarding the budget, the MFF, where we had the frugal five, all of which have fewer than 2 million, 3 million people in their populations. The really significant decisions that could push Hungary and Poland back into liberal democratic line still require unanimity, conditionality, and infringement. Now add to this the fact that partisan gaps within the council, because of the diversification and the rise of national populist parties, the partisan gaps within the council are bigger and deeper than they were 20 years ago. Secondly, political unpredictability is exacerbated by the breakdown in the conventional Franco-German partnership. But this goes back, I think, to about 2007. Remember, Merkel didn't grow up facing the EU. She grew up facing the Warsaw Pact in the East. So it took her a number of years, first of all, to master the complex decision-making processes, but also to develop a kind of personal, more than instrumental, let me say sentimental attachment to the EU and its entire, its conception, its self-conception as a value community. Now, the initial breakdown came during the financial crisis. Merkel-Z turned into a real split. Merkel tended to look at Holland as a complete wipeout. And I think she still looks at Macron as somebody who brings a lot more bark than bite to the table. He is not particularly data-driven in contrast to his physicist counterpart. And then, of course, there's Brexit. Germany is chairing the first presidency where Brexit is officially in place. Now, Germany has lost a core ally on some issues and an adversary on others, but it could generally rely on the UK to maintain something of a balance with France. And now, because Britain is gone, the leadership expectations and demands on Germany have risen accordingly. Another fundamental change here, the efforts to forge co-decision compromises with the European Parliament have also been hindered by the presence of strong right-wing populists since 2014. In the 2019 election, the Eurosceptics and the Europhobes had a combined force of about 20%. So there's been this shift now to non-participatory, rather elitist trilogues. Although many of these Europhobic, Eurosceptic people failed to participate in European Parliament committee work, by now, a lot of them have figured out how to throw wrenches into that legislative machine. Another point, policy and crises, the spillover effects today are a lot more complicated than they were in the 1950s, 1960s, and even the 1970s, when coal and steel were one thing, agriculture was another thing, and nobody thought about their negative, much less their combined impact on climate and the environment. Introducing the Troika, or the trio president, in 2009, moreover testifies to the need for ever longer term planning, symbolized by the multi-year financial framework. These budgets involve ever larger sums of money committed for ever longer periods, but the national politicians who sit in the council must approve them, even though they are driven by much shorter election cycles. Last but not least, I need to mention the gender factor. We have this dynamic duo, as Gabi mentioned. Merkel and von der Leyen have a long history of working together, but they also turned out to be surprisingly progressive in terms of some of the gender equality policies. At least Germany has this corporate board law now on the books, along with many of the reconciliation policies. But as progressive as they may have been inside the country, their respective job descriptions now pit them against each other. They sit in different camps. One is required to think supranationally. The other is still supposed to be defending national interest. And this requires them to sometimes take incompatible approaches. For example, the corporate boards directive. Primarily interested in finance and energy questions, Barroso and Juncker were really missing in action in a lot of other key domains. Juncker's response to the financial meltdown was austerity, austerity, and more austerity. There was nothing proactive about that. He then left it up to Merkel to find compromises regarding the refugee crisis. There's a lot of empirical evidence that shows that men often get praised for doing something, anything, for example, around the home, while women are generally faulted for failing to do more than they've already done. In my judgment, the expectations applied to the Council Presidency were high not only because of Germany's physical size and economic clout, but also because Merkel had demonstrated so much effective leadership through many a crisis over the last 15 years. I also think, personally, that analysts and pundits continue to impose tougher evaluation standards when it comes to women's political performance. It's great that the Commission is now committed to a more holistic approach. I think this is something von der Leyen learned from her boss. But von der Leyen is now where Merkel stood in 2007. She still has to put quite a learning curve behind her in order to be able to manage the EU the way Merkel has managed Germany over the last 15 years. Yes, they do talk regularly, but they have to maintain separate spheres. The good news is that the number of European female prime ministers has reached an all-time high, although they will lose their German role model come September. Germany, Denmark, Finland, Estonia, Slovakia, Greece, and Lithuania all have female prime ministers. We can add to that Norway, Iceland, Serbia, and Moldova, all of whom have some now regular connection to the EU. That's not quite critical mass, but I think if you combine it with near parity in the Commission, these leaders could help to change the tone in the Council and avoid some of the all or nothing stances taken by Poland and Hungary. Given what Europe was or used to be, I think the list of things that were achieved during the German Council presidency is actually quite impressive. Securing agreement on the mega recovery fund, especially getting her own country to accept the debt mechanism that Gabi mentioned, allowing them to fund this mega new generation project, all of which she had to reject, and Germans themselves were more likely to reject during the Euro crisis. This will enable the Commission to extend $500 billion euros in grants to countries hardest hit by the pandemic, which might make some of them more amenable to the new Green Deal as part of that recovery plan. Approving the parameters of the climate law and the Just Transition Fund. What goes around comes around. Merkel was the one who brought climate change to the EU with that 2007 presidency. Getting any form of rule of law conditionality into the MFF, I think was, as Gabi pointed out, a paradigmatic shift, a monumental change. It may be watered down, but once it's on paper, you can do something with it. The European Pillar of Social Rights, including some initiatives on gender equality. Let's connect this to the gender equality strategy that was introduced right after von der Leyen assumed her post as president of the Commission. The Lisbon Treaty was the first to incorporate or to give binding force of law to the Charter of Fundamental Rights. And all these things, I think, are part of the larger Merkel legacy. I could also mention the new Pact on Asylum and Migration, which I have read in excruciating detail, and the devil is in fact in the detail. But this migration idea came up in the first German presidency in 2007. So you see, what goes around comes around, and it does take a lot of patience in order to bring about political change. Now, Gabi and I have regular Skype discussions trying to debate whether the glass is half full or half empty on a number of these issues. So at this point, I will stop and leave it up to the argument, to the audience to pose some specific, insightful questions to Gabi, since we can always discuss this during our next Skype meeting. Thank you.
Thanks so much to both of you. We have a few minutes left for questions and answers. If anybody would like to type it into the Q&A function at the bottom, but maybe I'll start with a comment/question, which is, so Gabi, you mentioned that in the end, you thought that the council presidency was a mixed bag. And this also speaks to Joyce's recounting of your conversations, whether the glass is half empty or half full. I definitely see the glass as half full as opposed to half empty. And I actually think that it was one of the most momentous presidencies that I can remember for years, if not decades, just given the number of challenges that were on the agenda and how masterfully, of course, after all-night negotiation sessions and whatnot, but how masterfully Merkel and von der Leyen were able to get agreement in the end. I mean, I think that this MFF, this NGEU policy is, absolutely revolutionary. I think the trade or the investment agreement with China is also a massive deal, which certainly has created a lot of buzz here in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. I think dealing with the Brits and staving off, a complete no-deal Brexit, I think these are kind of massive achievements. And then with gender policy, migration policy, green policy also kind of at least being discussed. I mean, I think that it was really quite impactful. So maybe you could provide a few more details for why you see it more of a mixed bag as opposed to a resounding success.
Yes, thanks, Eric. I'm happy to do that. Well, of course, the Germans themselves, they would put a lot of emphasis on the actual successes that have been made. And maybe I just put the link to the German government's review of the council presidency into the chat function, because that's a long report which also gives a lot of information about the different legislative pieces that have come to a conclusion as part of the trilogues and all that. But to me, well, yes, I think it's still a mixed bag, because to me, the way that this was watered down, the conditionality, the rule of law conditionality, that is something that is very, very difficult to sustain. Now the Hungarians go to the European Court of Justice because they think it's completely illegal and against the treaties. We'll see what the court will do with that. I suppose that the court will sustain the compromise. But certainly to me, I would have wished for a stronger conditionality mechanisms, because the whole rule of law mechanism is not also in general related to this Article 7 is not as strong as I wished it would be. And for a number of other issues that I would have hoped for more successes, for stricter regulations and guidelines when it comes to the Just Transition Fund and to the climate law. in relation to agricultural subsidies, I think, then, which is key, of course, for climate policy, there is still too much leeway, too much room for the member states to come up with their own regulations, and a lot of that will go counter against the actual intentions here. So I was always hoping for stricter rules from the EU with more power for the Commission to monitor that. Because the Council is not very good in monitoring itself and the performance here. And certainly I think, because Joyce mentioned this women on board, I was very angry when I heard Merkel's speech on International Women's Day, when she was calling and that there is a need for having more women on boards. But it would have been so easy for her with her Richtlinien competence just to let it go. And even, I mean, Joyce, you remember that when we were in Brussels together last time, talking to the people in the German permanent representation, the women working in that unit were hoping that during the Council Presidency, Germany would give up its resistance. And given that there is still that there is a national law in place now, but then it would have been easy for Merkel to tell her ministers, her social democratic ministers, to agree on that. But she was still, I think, making too many compromises to the conservative parts of her party. Although one could say she's a lame duck now, she has nothing to lose. So I still wonder why not more leadership also on these kind of issues. Yes, but so I think it's pretty mixed, and for a number of issues we will really wait for what's going to happen in the next 2-3 years to really say how successful was it. It's very difficult to say that or as soon as it finished.
All right, we're going a little over time, but I can't resist just one more question, which obviously has come up in both of your remarks. But you know, we've talked quite a bit about Merkel and her kind of leadership and effectiveness. But I'd like to hear a few more thoughts about von der Leyen, because obviously she also was instrumental in whatever was decided or not decided. She's also gotten some criticism in the press vis-a-vis Britain, vis-a-vis vaccines and things like that. So maybe just some thoughts on your assessment of von der Leyen's leadership.
She's an interesting person here, and I what I really appreciate that she's very, very ambitious and that she's very serious on bringing the EU forward. But it will take her a while to really get used to what it means to lead the Commission, which is a very tricky, well, it's a hybrid because it's a bureaucracy, but it's certainly also a political institution. And there is a lot of talk that she is just too much putting on her own plate instead of delegating to competent professional people around her. And then, of course, that leads to that she's going to be blamed for the mistakes that are made. And there are always mistakes made. And there were some mistakes made in relation to the vaccination strategy, and certainly in relation to the UK with the idea of blocking just exports of vaccination and all that. Well, so I think she's, as Joyce said, there is still a learning curve that we will see, but she has, I think, the right stamina to become a good European leader, and it will be interesting to follow what's going to happen in the next half of her presidency.
Joyce, would you like to? Yes.
Yes, again, I will stick to this idea of the learning curve, but just as importantly, she was in charge of 3 different ministries in the Merkel cabinet, and the Resortprinzip, she had a lot more control over ministries than she has over the entire commission and the DGs and the council and all the things that come out of that. And I think a lot of the press criticism has focused as much on her style and on her kind of personal behavior, more so than it has looked at the detailed plans that have been put out there. Obviously, she wasn't able to achieve in the first 100 days what she promised during her July 2019 speech because of the pandemic. But I had also spent some time, as Gabi knows, looking at her tenure as Germany's first female defense minister. And when you just list all the policies that she managed to push through, particularly with regard to gender relations, it's kind of astounding. And yet they were all very focused on her scandal over the McKinsey hiring of the consultants and the things like this. So I do think it's still a question of women being judged differently or assessed differently for matters of style rather than for actual policy content. And she has to learn to master all of these multi-level things where she does not have the control that she had back in a national ministry. So stay tuned for that book.
All right, well, like I said, we've gone a little over time, but this has been a wonderful discussion, very informative and analytical. So I really would like to thank Professor Abels and Professor Mushaben. And to those of you that have tuned in, we have another event coming up next week that I want to plug really quickly. So that's on Tuesday, the 23rd of March, starting at noon Eastern Standard Time, which will be on the Greens. And this is part of our 2021 Bundestag election project here at AICGS. So thank you for coming today. And I would be remiss to not wish everybody, especially our Irish friends and family, a happy St. Patrick's Day. Goodbye, everybody.